I do believe that Putin was deeply committed to finding a negotiated settlement to the problem. As I said to you in my formal comments, he was deeply committed to the Minsk agreement because what he wanted to do was shut down the conflict in the Donbass so he would not have to invade. And with regard to NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the efforts to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's borders, he went to great lengths to explain to the West why that was unacceptable. And on December 17th, 2022, he sent a letter to Putin. Putin sent a letter to Biden and to NATO saying that you have to do X, Y, and Z so we can find a solution to this problem. And we refused to go along. And I think that Putin was left in a position where he felt he had no choice. Because to answer your question, there was no other way to deal with the problem. So I think he, with great reluctance, invaded Ukraine.
Why did Finland and Sweden enter NATO, join NATO, if they didn't fear Russia? So if you could address NATO expansion.
I think that there's no question that the Finns and the Norwegians fear Russia. I mean, given the level of Russophobia in the West, and given all the talk since 2014, and certainly since February 2022 about the Russian threat, it would make perfect sense for lots of Finns to fear the Russians. Do I believe that they should have feared the Russians? No. They survived the Cold War perfectly well when the Soviet Union was a heck of a lot more of a formidable adversary than Russia is. And furthermore, as I've emphasized time after time, there is zero evidence that Putin ever said he was interested in conquering and absorbing Ukraine into a greater Russia, much less that he was interested in conquering any other countries. He just never said that. The idea that he was going to conquer Finland or take some Finnish territory or Swedish territory is not a serious argument to me. But my opinion is that serious arguments don't carry the day in the world that we now live in. And, you know, the Finns and the Swedes obviously thought there was a serious threat here. And what they think does matter, as I said before. And this was a good opportunity to sneak into NATO because the Russians are obviously in no position to do anything about it because they're pinned down in Ukraine. But I would just end by saying that anybody who thinks this is all for the good is thinking wrongly. This is not good. It's just going to give the Russians an increased sense of vulnerability, an increased sense that they're being surrounded, and it's going to scare the Russians, and it's going to make them take greater risks. I've spent my life studying great power politics, and one thing you never want to underestimate is when you corner a great power and you threaten a great power, excuse me, you do not want to underestimate the risk that it might be willing to take. And the Russians are in that category for sure. And by the way, we all know about the Arctic, and we know that there are 8 countries that are located in the Arctic. One is Russia. The other 7 now are all NATO countries. The other 7 are all NATO countries, and Russia's up there. And you know what's happening to the ice up in that neck of the woods, right? The ice is melting. And you know that has all sorts of consequences of an economic and strategic nature. So there's going to be security competition up there. You think it's good that the Finns and the Swedes are with those other NATO countries against Russia? I don't think so. I think it's just more evidence of the trouble that lies ahead. The Biden administration could have prevented the war by working out a deal with the Russians that would have satisfied Russia's security concerns. We're simply unwilling to do that. Very important to understand that Joe Biden handled the Ukraine portfolio during the Obama administration. When he was vice president, he handled the Ukraine portfolio, and he was a super hawk on Ukraine. And when he came into the White House in January 2021, shortly thereafter, that's when the trouble started. Because what Biden did was he doubled down, right? And Zelensky, who was initially elected to work out a peace deal with the Russians and to shut down the conflict in the Donbass, Zelensky did a flip at the same time that Biden moved into the White House. Zelensky became deeply anti-Russian in early 2021, and he became deeply committed, which he hadn't been in the past, to bringing Ukraine into NATO. So Biden and Zelensky together, right, upped the ante. And what did the Russians do? You remember in April 2021, that's when the Russians mobilized their army and put large forces on Ukraine's border. It's no accident that that happened in April 2021, given that Joe Biden moved into the White House in January 2021. And then in December 2021, December 17th, that's when Putin sent the letter to Biden and sent the letter to Stoltenberg, right? And then in January 2022, Tony Blinken made it very clear in response to the December 17th letter that the United States was not going to change its policy one iota.
So the question then is if the West's support for Ukraine were to stop, would their peace demands, would that change your forecast on your pessimistic forecast on diplomacy?
Well, if the West stops arming Ukraine, Ukraine is doomed, right? There's just no question about that, right? I mean, the Russians have an indigenous armaments industry that's actually quite impressive. They have an armaments industry that's designed to fight World War I. And since this war looks like World War I, they're in quite good shape. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, do not have an industrial base that comes even close to being able to fight this kind of war. So they're heavily dependent on us. And by the way, we have trouble. We have trouble giving the Ukrainians what they need. They need artillery. We can't give them artillery fast enough. That's the problem. That's why we're giving them things like tanks and talking about F-16s. We don't have the artillery to give to them, okay? But the point is, John, they depend heavily, the Ukrainians depend heavily on the West for money, right, to keep their government running, and they depend heavily on us for weapons, and will roll of weapons to Ukraine. The Russians would be in the driver's seat. There's just no question about that. But we're not going to do that. We're in this one too deep. You remember how long it took us to get out of Afghanistan? 20 years. 20 years to get out of Afghanistan. And a lot of us in this room were old enough to remember the Vietnam War. It tore the country apart, and it took us a long time to get out of that war. And it was only when Congress basically told the executive, this war's got to end, right? And we're a long way from that point in this country at this point in time. So I think we're in. I think the Europeans are in. Our support may diminish somewhat, but I don't think it's going to diminish much.
Okay. There are kind of two related questions. What Putin apparently has told Bush that Ukraine is not a real country. Is Putin really how do the Russians view Ukraine as a totally separate country or part of Russia? And there's that very big history. And then the question is related is assuming you are correct, and Ukraine loses, and what comes next? And this is the question of whether they have ambitions outside of this war towards Poland or other Eastern European countries. You hear that all the time by people who support the war.
Yeah, I'll take them in reverse order. What comes next? What comes next? If the Russians were to conquer 4 more oblasts and basically stop there, because that was all the territory they wanted, given the demographics, I think the Russians would then spend the next 25 to 30 years trying to absorb those 8 oblasts into Russia. You understand, when you see places like Bakhmut, you see the pictures of Bakhmut, how it's been totally destroyed. Well, that's going to be Russian territory, right? They're going to have to repair Bakhmut. There's going to be a huge amount, I didn't talk about this, of ethnic cleansing that takes place, or population transfers. Lots of ethnic Ukrainians are going to move west, and lots of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians are going to move westward. Both countries are going to have their hands full trying to absorb those people. Russia has economic problems. It had economic problems before this war started. It has economic problems that are a consequence of this war. The last thing the Russians are going to want to do is invade the Baltic states or invade Poland. One more point on this. If you look at the Soviet experience in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, trying to occupy and manage their so-called allies in Eastern Europe, it was actually something of a nightmare. In 1953, they didn't have to invade East Germany because they were already there, but they had to put down an insurrection. They had to go into Hungary in 1956. They had to go into Czechoslovakia in 1968. They almost went into Poland 3 separate times, except the Polish communists put down the problem, right? Then they had to deal with the Albanians and the Romanians. Talk about something that could really give you a headache. The last thing the Russians want to do is conquer those territories which are filled with people who hate Russians, don't want to be part of Russia, and will put up great resistance. It makes no sense at all. And this is why Putin has never said he had any interest in creating a greater Russia or incorporating all of those Ukrainians into a greater Russia. It's the porcupine problem. It would have been like swallowing a porcupine. So my argument is that when all is said and done, what Putin is going to concentrate on, or his successors are going to concentrate on, is just absorbing the territory that they now have. Now, with regard to the first question, this gets to causes. I often say, as I said here tonight, there's no evidence that Putin was interested in conquering Ukraine. And the argument that people will turn to is they'll say, he told George W. Bush that Ukraine is not a real country, okay? And you want to say to yourself, is this a piece of evidence that he was bent on conquering Ukraine? First of all, if he said this, it's the only time he ever said it, right? It's the only time he ever said it. And number two, it's not clear that's what he said, because he was telling George Bush, who was telling us. And I'm not accusing George Bush of being disingenuous, but who knows, right? But this is the one example. But let's assume he told Bush that, and Bush gave us an accurate representation of what Putin says. So what? He said it's not a real country. Did he say, I want to conquer that country? Did he say, I think it's feasible to conquer that country? Did he say that I can do it? That's what I'm going to do, right? No, there's no evidence of that. And of course, what's the key document they point to? You know, when I make that offer, that response to that quote, everybody goes to the July 12th, 2021 article that Putin wrote, right? That's supposed to be the smoking gun that he was going to conquer Ukraine. This is not a serious argument. Right? He says exactly the opposite. It's very clear from the piece, the July 12th, 2021 piece, that he recognizes Ukrainian nationalism. He recognizes it. It's very clear that he recognizes that Ukraine is an independent country. And he recognizes that the events of December 1991 are locked in stone, that there's no way, right, you can go back to the Soviet Union. And he ends his article by saying that what Ukraine becomes is what the Ukrainian people will decide it will become. So there is no evidence other than this one quote, which I don't think is real evidence, that he was bent on conquering Ukraine. And by the way, if anybody thinks I'm wrong, I wish you would send me an email with the evidence that shows I'm wrong. I engage on the internet all the time with people who write me, who say that he had designs on conquering all of Ukraine and absorbing it into a greater Russia. I tell them to send me the evidence. And I say, I want hard evidence, right? And none.
So another question is, what will be the impact of these F-16s being sent to Ukraine? You talked about the artillery ratios, but where do the F-16s come in the military balance?
I don't think the F-16s will matter very much at all for a variety of reasons. First of all, it takes a lot of time to train pilots to fly an F-16. You just don't produce combat pilots overnight. You know, if you go back to the Battle of Midway in World War I, June 1942, about 6 months after Pearl Harbor, you remember we sunk 4 Japanese carriers at Midway, and this was seen as a mortal blow to the Japanese Navy. Actually, it wasn't the carriers that mattered that much. It was all the pilots that we killed. It just takes, you know, my brother was a Navy pilot. And he used to talk about this all the time. It just takes a long period of time to train first-rate pilots. And so they're not going to have first-rate pilots for a while. They're talking about, you know, training them up in 4 months and then putting them in the cockpit and sending them into combat. That's not going to work very well. Second point is, the Russians, by all accounts, have the best ground-based air defenses in the world with their S-400s, S-300s, and all these other systems. Those F-16s are going to be in real trouble going up against the ground-based air defenses. The other thing is that the Russians have a formidable air force of their own that has lots of combat experience, is gaining combat experience, and will be ready to engage those F-16s. I think the real danger with the F-16s is that the Ukrainians use them to attack targets in Russia. Right? This is the escalation scenario, right? And we apparently, President Biden apparently has told the Ukrainians in no uncertain terms that they cannot use the F-16s to attack targets inside of Ukraine. And inside of Russia, thank you. Yeah, inside of Russia. And apparently they have promised, but I wouldn't bank on them delivering on that promise, because you all know that the Ukrainians have a vested interest in dragging us into the war, right? You understand that. If you're playing Ukraine's hand, you want to suck the Americans in to come to your defense. And Biden, of course, is fully aware of that, as are his advisors, and they're trying to protect against it. But it's a very tricky issue because we can't cut and run. What are we going to do if the Ukrainians start using their F-16s to attack the Kremlin or attack targets in Russia? Are we going to say, all right, we quit, you're on your own now? Of course we're not. We're going to holler at them, tell them don't do it again. But slowly but steadily, we're going to be pulled in, because at some point the Russians are going to retaliate. You know, by the way, one point that I didn't make to you folks, that's a very important point to keep in mind. I said that I think the Russians are going to win on the battlefield. They will end up winning this war. If I'm wrong and the Russians lose, and that the Biden administration begins to move in a direction where its goals are being achieved in Ukraine, I think the likelihood of nuclear use is high. I think the Russians are likely, maybe even very likely, to turn to nuclear weapons if they're losing. So the fact that the Russians are likely to win this war, in my opinion, makes the possibility of nuclear war much less likely.
So we got a couple of questions about Russia being Russia being incorporated into Europe. What the Russian Federation membership in NATO? What went wrong? And then a related question: some Eurasian Union that would include the Russian Federation plus the former Warsaw USSR countries and the European Union. Is that in the U.S. interest or not? You can take those.
Yeah, I think that it would have been in the U.S. interest to work out some sort of security arrangement with the Russians starting in January of 1992. Remember, Soviet Union falls apart in December 1991. The next month, January 1992. I think we had a deep-seated interest in having good relations with the Russians. My theory of great power politics tells me that if you're dealing with a really powerful Russia that's a peer competitor to us, the way China is a peer competitor to us in East Asia, you're going to have significant problems with Russia, right? Just like you had significant problems with the Soviet Union. In May of 1945, when Germany was finally defeated, you had this huge Russian army in the middle of Europe. Germany was destroyed. France had been knocked out of the war and was badly weakened. Britain was badly weakened by the war. We were greatly fearful that the Soviet Union would march all the way to the Atlantic just because it had such a powerful military. The Russians today are not the Soviet Union. They just aren't. So, and they certainly were not the Soviet Union in the 1990s. You will remember what a basket case Russia was in the 1990s. What we should have done was gone to great lengths to work out some sort of modus vivendi in Europe. And again, this is what people like Kennan, Bill Perry, General Shalishashvili, all these people understood, that, poking the Russians in the eye with a stick, which is what we did with NATO expansion, was going to be counterproductive in the end, as it's turned out to be the case. And what we should have done was try to work out some sort of security arrangement, which I actually think could have been done, because again, the Russians were not likely to go on the prowl.